We move through invisible stages. Every glance we imagine, every thought we think, feels heavier than it is. Yet most of this weight exists only in the mind. Pause. Breathe. Notice how fleeting each moment really is. When we step into the world of human perception, it becomes clear that the way we see ourselves often diverges sharply from the way the world sees us. We walk through streets, attend meetings, speak in public, or even scroll through social media, all the while feeling that every gaze, every glance, every tiny slip or hesitation is magnified, scrutinized, and remembered. This sensation, the ever-present feeling that we are under constant observation, has a name in psychology: the spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is a cognitive bias, a quirk of the human mind, in which we overestimate the attention others pay to our actions, appearances, and even our thoughts. It is as if a spotlight follows us wherever we go, illuminating every small gesture, every misstep, every moment of self-consciousness, making it seem larger than it truly is. In reality, however, this spotlight is largely imaginary. The world is not focused on us as much as we believe. People are immersed in their own lives, their own thoughts, and their own concerns. And yet, the feeling persists, shaping behavior, influencing choices, and often amplifying anxiety. Consider the moments when you stumble over words in a conversation, spill coffee on your shirt, or laugh at the wrong time. You may feel as though every eye is on you, recording, judging, remembering. But in truth, these events are fleeting for others, soon forgotten, while your own mind may replay them endlessly. The spotlight effect magnifies our perception of self-importance in social situations, casting an imaginary glow on minor errors and imagined flaws. The irony is profound. The very mind that scrutinizes us so intensely is the same one that misleads us about the attention of others. To understand this effect more deeply, we must explore its origins in human evolution. Humans are inherently social creatures. Survival depended on being attuned to social hierarchies, alliances, and acceptance. Awareness of how others perceived us was crucial. This sensitivity became wired into our cognition. Today, however, in a world vastly different from that of our ancestors, this acute social radar can exaggerate perceived scrutiny. The brain continues to alert us to potential social risks, even when they are negligible, making us feel exposed under an imaginary spotlight. The spotlight effect also intersects with another phenomenon: the illusion of transparency. We tend to believe that our internal states, our nervousness, anxiety, excitement, or guilt, are far more visible to others than they actually are. When combined with the spotlight effect, this illusion intensifies, creating a sense of perpetual social exposure. We think our thoughts, our self-consciousness, and even our insecurities are apparent to all. In reality, others are rarely aware of the depth of our internal experience. The mind exaggerates, projecting an audience onto the canvas of our social interactions that is far more attentive than it truly is. Understanding the spotlight effect offers liberation. By recognizing its cognitive nature, we gain perspective. The next time you feel flustered by a minor mistake, remember that the spotlight is largely a product of your imagination. Others are focused on their own lives, their own thoughts, and their own small missteps. Awareness of this truth reduces the weight of social anxiety, allowing for freer expression, greater confidence, and more authentic engagement. Furthermore, the spotlight effect is not only a source of anxiety, it also shapes behavior in subtle ways. It can encourage caution, meticulousness, and social harmony. People may act more kindly, dress more carefully, or choose words with thoughtfulness because they feel observed. Yet, excessive focus on this imagined scrutiny can limit spontaneity, creativity, and genuine self-expression. The challenge lies in balancing awareness with perspective, in acknowledging the effect without allowing it to dominate. The spotlight effect also has profound implications for our perception of mistakes and failures. We tend to judge ourselves harshly, believing that errors are glaring, that every flaw is magnified before others' eyes. But when we step back, we often realize that what felt monumental was, in reality, insignificant to others. Understanding this allows for self-compassion, a gentler approach to personal growth, and the courage to act despite fear of judgment. In this way, awareness of the spotlight effect becomes a tool for resilience and insight, not just a source of anxiety. Social media amplifies the effect, creating a constant stage where likes, comments, and views seem to validate the spotlight's intensity. The mind interprets attention, or lack thereof, as judgment. Yet, even here, the spotlight effect is deceptive. Metrics are not direct measures of human perception or value. The world does not observe us as intensely as we imagine, even when screens make it seem otherwise. By understanding this, we can navigate digital spaces with greater mindfulness and less self-criticism. In conclusion, the spotlight effect is a fascinating lens through which to examine human perception. It reveals both the power and the limitations of the mind, highlighting the tension between self-awareness and social reality. By recognizing its influence, we can cultivate perspective, reduce unnecessary anxiety, and embrace the freedom to act authentically. The next time you feel the imagined gaze of others, remember that the spotlight exists primarily in your own mind. And in that realization lies the possibility of liberation, courage, and genuine human connection. And so, as we begin to explore the nuances of social perception, the spotlight effect reminds us that much of what we fear is a reflection of our own thoughts, not an objective reality. In understanding this, we gain insight not only into the workings of the mind, but also into the nature of human interaction, empathy, and self-compassion. The journey has just begun. In the first part, we explored the idea that we tend to overestimate how much attention others pay to us. But understanding the spotlight effect on a surface level is only the beginning. To truly grasp its influence, we must look at how deeply it shapes our behavior, our decisions, and even our sense of identity. The spotlight effect does not merely create momentary discomfort. It subtly governs the way we move through the world. It whispers caution where freedom could exist. It encourages silence where expression might have emerged. Many choices we believe to be rational are, in fact, shaped by the fear of being noticed, judged, or remembered. Consider how often people hesitate before speaking, not because they lack ideas, because they imagine an audience scrutinizing every word. A misplaced phrase feels catastrophic. A pause feels exposed. Yet this imagined audience rarely exists in the way we think it does. Each person is carrying their own spotlight, aimed inward, preoccupied with their own performance, their own doubts, their own invisible mistakes. The spotlight effect feeds perfectionism. When we believe we are constantly observed, errors feel dangerous. Small flaws feel permanent. We attempt to polish ourselves into something acceptable, something unremarkable enough to avoid attention, yet impressive enough to earn approval. This tension creates exhaustion. The mind becomes a stage manager, endlessly rehearsing lines that may never be spoken. Psychologically, this effect is reinforced by memory. We vividly remember our own awkward moments while forgetting those of others. This imbalance creates an illusion. If our mistakes feel unforgettable to us, we assume they must be unforgettable to everyone else. In reality, most people forget our missteps almost instantly, not out of cruelty, but out of simple human limitation. Attention is scarce, memory is selective, and most of it is spent on the self. There is a quiet paradox here. The more we fear being seen, the less we allow ourselves to truly exist. The spotlight effect narrows behaviour, it reduces spontaneity, it teaches us to minimize risk, even when the risk is merely social. Over time, this avoidance can become a lifestyle, safe, controlled, and profoundly limiting. Yet the effect also reveals something important about human empathy. Because we assume others are watching us closely, we often behave more carefully, more politely, more thoughtfully. The belief in being observed can foster moral awareness. But when taken too far, it transforms awareness into self-surveillance. We stop living and start managing impressions. Modern life intensifies this phenomenon. Social media creates a constant sense of exposure, even in solitude. We are no longer just imagining observers. Numbers and metrics give the illusion of proof. Views, likes, silence, and comparison amplify the feeling that our presence is being evaluated. The spotlight effect becomes persistent, no longer situational, but ambient. However, the deeper truth remains unchanged. Even in digital spaces, people are fleeting observers. They scroll, glance, forget. What feels monumental to us often registers as a brief impression to others, if it registers at all. Understanding this does not make us invisible. It makes us free. Freedom emerges when we realize that attention is not as focused as we fear. That judgment is not as permanent as it feels. That most people are not critics, but mirrors, reflecting their own concerns rather than examining ours. When the imagined spotlight dims, something shifts. Action becomes lighter. Expression becomes less rehearsed. Mistakes lose their symbolic weight. We begin to move not as performers, but as participants in a shared uncertainty. The spotlight effect teaches us less about others and more about ourselves. It reveals how powerfully the mind constructs reality, how easily fear can masquerade as fact. By recognizing this, we reclaim space, the space to speak imperfectly, to act without guarantees, to exist without constant self-correction. In the end, the spotlight we fear is rarely external. It is internal, fueled by memory, expectation, and imagination. And when we understand that, we realize something quietly profound. The world is not watching us nearly as closely as we think. And perhaps it never was. As we move deeper into the spotlight effect, something becomes clear. This is no longer just about social anxiety or awkward moments. It is about how the mind constructs a silent audience, and how that imagined presence slowly shapes the way we understand ourselves. At some point, the fear of being observed stops coming from outside. It becomes internalized. We no longer need people around us to feel watched. The gaze lives inside the mind. It evaluates tone, posture, intention. It edits thoughts before they become words. The spotlight effect transforms from a social illusion into a form of self-monitoring. This inner observer is subtle but powerful. It creates a split between who we are and who we think we should appear to be. Actions are no longer just actions. They are performances measured against an invisible standard. Even solitude can feel staged. Even silence can feel exposed. Philosophers have long warned about this internal division. When attention turns inward too sharply, the self becomes both actor and judge. Life becomes reflective rather than lived. Instead of moving naturally through experience, we step back and watch ourselves move, correcting and restraining at every moment. The spotlight effect thrives on uncertainty. We do not actually know what others think, but the mind fills the silence with assumptions. It imagines criticism where there is neutrality, meaning where there is randomness, permanence where there is only a passing glance. The absence of information becomes fertile ground for fear. What makes this effect particularly persistent is that it rarely contradicts itself. We remember the moments that support it and forget the countless times we were unnoticed. This selective memory reinforces the belief that visibility is constant, that judgment is inevitable. In this way, the mind quietly edits reality to maintain its own narrative. Over time, this can lead to a shrinking of identity. We begin to define ourselves not by what feels true, but by what feels acceptable. Expression is filtered. Curiosity is restrained. Risk is avoided, not because it is dangerous, but because it might be seen. The fear is no longer about failure itself, but about being observed while failing. Yet there is an important insight hidden within this illusion. The imagined observer is often a reflection of our own values, our own fears, our own internal standards. We project our self-criticism outward and experience it as external pressure. In other words, the spotlight is often aimed by us, not at us. When this realization begins to settle, something shifts. The gaze loses its authority. The inner audience becomes quieter. Not because the world has changed, but because the narrative has loosened its grip. We begin to see attention as something fluid and unstable, not fixed and oppressive. There is also a deeper philosophical question at play. What does it mean to exist without constant self-observation? To act without narrating? To speak without imagining reception? These moments are rare, but when they occur, they feel unusually light. Time moves differently. The boundary between self and world softens. The spotlight effect teaches us how easily awareness turns into control. It shows how consciousness, when misdirected, can limit rather than liberate. But it also points toward the possibility of release, not through invisibility, but through acceptance of uncertainty. We do not need to erase the imagined audience. We only need to stop believing it defines us. Attention will come and go. Judgment will appear and fade. What remains is the simple act of being present, unedited and incomplete. In the end, the most powerful realization is not that we are unseen, but that being seen is rarely as significant as we imagine. Life does not require a flawless performance. It only requires participation. And when the spotlight finally dims, we are left not with emptiness, but with space. Space to exist without constantly watching ourselves exist. At this stage, the spotlight effect no longer appears as a simple mental bias. It begins to resemble a lens through which we interpret existence itself. A quiet distortion that shapes how reality feels, not how it actually is. When we believe we are constantly observed, the world turns into a stage. Every movement feels symbolic. Every choice feels representative of who we are supposed to be. Life becomes less about experience and more about meaning. Meaning imposed from the outside, or at least imagined to be. This imagined gaze alters our relationship with time. Moments lose their softness. The present is no longer allowed to simply unfold. It must justify itself. We rush, hesitate, rehearse. Even rest becomes performative. Even stillness feels like something that could be misinterpreted. Under the spotlight effect, identity hardens. We begin to mistake consistency for authenticity. We fear contradiction because it feels visible. We avoid change because it draws attention. Slowly, the self becomes a fixed shape, safe, familiar, and quietly restrictive. Yet existence itself is unstable. Thoughts shift, desires evolve, moods contradict each other. The pressure to appear coherent denies this natural fluidity. The spotlight effect demands clarity where life offers ambiguity. And in doing so, it creates friction between who we are and who we allow ourselves to be. There is a deeper illusion at work here. The belief that being seen gives meaning to actions. That without an audience, experience somehow loses value. But meaning does not emerge from observation. It emerges from engagement, from presence, from participation without witnesses. Philosophically, this touches something ancient. The question of whether life is lived for others or for itself. When awareness turns outward too aggressively, we outsource our sense of reality. We begin to measure existence through imagined reactions rather than direct sensation. The spotlight effect also distorts morality. Actions feel less about intention and more about appearance. We fear being misunderstood more than being wrong. This shifts ethics from inner alignment to external approval. The result is a fragile morality, dependent on visibility rather than conviction. But there is another way of seeing, a quieter one. When the imagined gaze softens, actions regain weight. Silence becomes neutral instead of suspicious. Failure becomes private again. The self loosens its edges. In this softened state, attention turns back toward the body, the breath, the immediate world. Experience stops asking for explanation. The need to narrate dissolves. What remains is not emptiness, but intimacy, with the moment, with uncertainty, with being unfinished. The spotlight effect does not disappear entirely. Awareness of others is part of being human, but it can lose its dominance. It can become context rather than command, background rather than center. When this shift occurs, something subtle changes. Life becomes less about how it looks, and more about how it feels. Choices become quieter but more honest. Expression becomes less polished, but more alive. In the end, freedom does not come from invisibility. It comes from no longer needing to be seen in a particular way, from allowing the self to move without constant self-explanation. The world does not require a performance. It only asks for presence. And when we finally step out of the imagined spotlight, we do not disappear. We arrive. At the end of this journey, the spotlight effect no longer feels like something to fight against. It feels like something to be understood and then gently set aside. Not rejected, not erased, simply placed where it belongs. The illusion of constant attention was never a mistake of intelligence. It was a byproduct of awareness, a side effect of being conscious among other conscious beings. We imagine eyes because we know what it means to look. We imagine judgment because we know what it means to evaluate. In that sense, the spotlight effect is not a flaw. It is a mirror. But mirrors are not meant to be lived inside of. When we spend too much time watching ourselves, life becomes delayed. Experience turns into anticipation. Meaning becomes conditional. We begin to exist slightly in the future, waiting for reactions that may never come. The present becomes something we pass through rather than inhabit. Freedom does not arrive as a sudden disappearance of fear. It arrives quietly, through familiarity, through repetition, through the realization that nothing catastrophic happens when we stop managing perception. The world does not collapse when we act imperfectly. People do not freeze us in memory. Moments dissolve faster than we expect. This is where perspective changes. The imagined audience does not vanish, but it loses importance. Attention becomes something that moves, rather than something that fixes. Being noticed becomes an event, not an identity. Judgment becomes a moment, not a verdict. There is also a deeper comfort hidden here. If we are not being watched as closely as we fear, then we are also not as alone as we think. Everyone is navigating the same uncertainty, carrying their own internal spotlight, rarely looking up long enough to truly observe anyone else. What we experience as isolation is often symmetry. In this understanding, self-expression softens. We speak without rehearsing entire futures. We act without narrating our own movements. The need to justify fades. Not because we no longer care, but because care finds a more stable ground. Philosophically, this is a return to immediacy, to life as sensation rather than image, to presence without commentary. The self stops being a project and becomes a process, something unfolding rather than something to be perfected. The spotlight effect taught us caution, but it also taught us imagination. And imagination, when no longer bound by fear, becomes creativity instead of restraint. The same mind that once anticipated judgment can now anticipate possibility. Nothing about this shift is dramatic. There is no final revelation, no sudden clarity, just a gradual dimming of unnecessary light. A quiet redistribution of attention. Less inward pressure, more outward openness. And perhaps this is the final truth. Life does not ask us to be convincing. It does not ask us to be consistent, impressive, or complete. It only asks us to be present while it happens. When the spotlight fades, we do not disappear into darkness. We step into a softer light, one that does not expose but allows. One that does not demand performance, but invites participation. And in that light, we are no longer watching ourselves live. We are simply living.